Welcome to this week's Behind the Poem. I don't think it's going to be possible for me to get through this without crying, so I'm just going to hit record and go for it. I've been sitting on a park bench crying for a while. Okay, so there's a lot of moving pieces and parts to why I've chosen this week's poem, and it's impossible for me to talk about without crying because it's very painful and it pulls at my moral fibers, and I'm very afraid to talk about all this out loud publicly, but I don't want to live in a world anymore where I have to be so afraid that I'm gonna lose friends or jobs or God knows what other risks by silencing myself when I feel in my soul, my neshama, which is Hebrew for soul, that I have to speak up and out. And there's no way I'm doing this intro in a minute or less, which is what I've started to tasking myself to doing each week. In a few days, it'll be Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement in Judaism, and we're currently in the days of awe when we take stock of our missteps for each other, ourselves, and the world, and we pray and we give tzedakah, charitable giving, and we take stock of the year past and what we want to make good of in the year ahead. I went to undergrad at the University of Pennsylvania, and you may or may not be following along, but there's been, I don't even like the word controversy. I don't know. The Palestine Rights Literature Festival is currently taking place at Penn. I've been following their work for a few years now, and I just want to say that I would not be the person, the poet, the human I am without the Palestinian poets and writers and artists whose voices lend themselves to this earth and this world and my community as a poet, as an artist, and a writer. And so I've been following and uplifting that festival and their work for a while. And it's at Penn this year. And because of the alleged histories of some of the speakers for the festival, a lot of people at Penn or related to Penn or not related to Penn who decided to involve themselves, push back on the festival in what I would personally call a profoundly divisive, tropey tactic of creating so much tension and harm. And it's nothing short of devastating in my mind. And there was an anti-Semitic attack at Penn's Hillel the other day, which is devastating and awful, and no one should fear for their safety anywhere. And the student newspaper article about it had what I would say, as a journalist, as an educator and facilitator, as a Jew, an unnecessary paragraph in there mentioning the festival and its alleged controversies. And meanwhile, what is happening in Israel right now is, I don't even have words, but there have been protests for months in Israel against the rising of an authoritarian government and state, which doesn't feel right for me to say based on how I have personally witnessed things happening for a long time. But I want to give a shout out to True Rabbis. I really appreciated their post today about taking stock of what's happening and all of our accountability as American Jews for allowing things to get to this point. I want to give a shout out and thanks to Rabbi Lizzie Heidemann at Mishkan, whose sermon at Rosh Hashanah this past weekend I found to be powerful and brave. I want to give a shout out to the Chavurah at Penn, which is a group of students that have put out statements supporting the festival on campus. And I want to give a shout out to everyone who is being harmed diasporically, locally, worldwide. And I wrote this poem. It's called, well, I'll tell you the title in a minute, but it's a form by Mahogany L. Browne called A Murmur. And the Murmur is a 38-line poem, and then a murmuration, which is every other line, and then an echo, which is, you'll hear. But Mahogany created this form to honor Cathay Williams, who was the only Black woman in the Buffalo Soldiers, 38th Infantry, and I was one of many poets invited to create a murmur poem for a collection. I wrote it several months ago, and that's what I'm going to share today. Wherever I stand, the sound. Their friend asks if I am Jewish, says, based on my last name. I don't tell him that is anti-Semitic. He tells me he's been to Israel because I am Jewish. I don't tell him that is anti-Semitic to randomly bring up Israel because I am Jewish. So I do the only thing I can. Ask if he also went to Palestine. That way he'll know where I stand. He leans against the pillar that borders the open concept kitchen we occupy, my body held up only by my feet. And yet I know that wherever I stand, I am always occupying someone else's land. But if the kitchen is unoccupied by borders, who controls the narrative of where I stand? In college, the slogan was, wherever I stand with Israel. But that is not where I stood. Not where I stand somewhere else. But I do not have a name for that place. On the sidewalk outside my apartment, I stand with Adam as he hands me his keys. I tell Adam about writing this poem. I tell him it's about Israel and Palestine. He laughs and says, of course, but it's not anti-Semitic, and it's not because I am Jewish. I tell him, but I never write poems about Israel and Palestine. He says he knows. I know he knows, because that's what I always do. I always write about the places where I stand, the unoccupied space, which does nothing to stop the occupation unless I take a stand. The murmur. The murmuration, the echo of wherever I stand. Based on my last name, he tells me he's been to Israel. I don't tell him that is anti-Semitic. Because I am Jewish, asks if he also went to Palestine. He leans against the pillar that borders my body held up only by my feet. I am always occupying someone else's land who controls the narrative of where I stand. Wherever I stand with Israel, not where I stand somewhere else on the sidewalk outside my apartment. I tell him, Adam, about writing this poem. He laughs and says, of course, and it's not because I am Jewish. Poems about Israel and Palestine, because that's what I always do, where I stand, the unoccupied place, which does nothing to stop the echo, based on my last name, because I am Jewish. My body held up only by my feet. Wherever I stand with Israel. I tell him, Adam, about writing this poem, poems about Israel and Palestine, which does nothing to stop. For so long, I couldn't financially afford to say all this, which is so sad. And I still can't financially afford to say all this at risk of losing work and gigs. But the truth is that I spiritually can't afford it anymore. And that's what I'm taking as I head into Yom Kippur. Shabbat Shalom. Shana Tova, and love to all.